Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Esoteric and our continuing series on the Steam Deck. More importantly, how to get emulators set up on it so you can get a great retro gaming experience on Valve's portable handheld gaming PC. And recently I did an episode on the best hidden gem and obvious PlayStation 1 games you should start with if you didn't grow up with it. And now we're doing the same thing for Sega Saturn because you guys asked for it. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe. That notification bell definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined to want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But right off the top, there's so many amazing games on the Sega Saturn, but it was a 2D powerhouse. So Marvel Super Heroes vs. Street Fighter is one game that I 100% recommend you check out on this system if you're a fan of fighting games. This is just incredible. The Sega Saturn was way beefier of a 2D platform versus the PlayStation 1, so of course I'm going to be recommending some amazing 2D games, but don't worry, 3D fans are going to get their fix as well. But this is just one of the best fighting games on the platform. It's one that's easy to pick up and play, but takes a lot of time to master. Play this with a friend on your Steam Deck, have two controllers hooked up to a dock. You're going to have an absolute blast of a time playing this. It's fast, it's fluid, it is such a good game, and compared to Street Fighter proper, it's not one that gets talked about near as much as I would think it would be. Everyone talks about Street Fighter 2, Alpha, and Street Fighter 3. This one, give it a go, trust me, you're going to love it. Now of course Saturn could also do 3D, pretty much close to as well as the PlayStation could, and one of my favorites that I don't hear people mention near as much is Fighting Vipers. Of course you're going to have Virtua Fighter and Virtua Fighter 2 and Dead or Alive, but for my money, Fighting Vipers is just one of those games that's unique, slightly different. Sega tried to play around with the fighting game formula a little bit more than usual, and it's one that I think a lot of people would enjoy on the Saturn if they knew it existed or if they gave it a shot. But I am curious if you guys have played Fighting Vipers before. Leave me a comment and tell me what games in this video you've experienced and what games you're going to play because you saw them afterwards. But Fighting Vipers is a ton of fun and you get a relatively decent roster. It's not the biggest thing in the world, but it's not small either. But just be aware if you notice that the video looks interlaced, that is because the Saturn has more than one video mode. And for a high resolution mode, they could interlace the artwork and graphics and everything you see on screen. So sometimes if you notice the footage looks a little bit interlaced, that's because it's a Saturn mode that it takes advantage of. Back to pure 2D though, Dracula X Nocturne in the Moonlight, the extended version 1.5 that brings in a lot of English translations and fixes, is in my opinion the preferred way to play Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Obviously I recommended it in my PlayStation 1 video, it's one of my favorite games of all time, but being able to play Maria in Symphony of the Night is just absolutely spectacular. This game has more characters, it has more areas in the PlayStation 1 version, and with this fixed patch, it gets very close to par with the PlayStation 1 version with loading and map access and things like that. But if you've never played Symphony of the Night before and you have a Steam Deck and you're wondering how you should play it, I am going to 100% recommend you start on Saturn. It's probably not going to be a popular opinion. I'll probably get a couple comments down below, but most people are nice about what I recommend anyway. But I think it is the definitive version of Symphony of the Night. I do recommend though if you've never played it before, start with Alucard, that is the game proper, and then move on to either a Richter or Maria run through, because they have different movesets, different ways to play. It does change up the core gameplay. But one that I want everyone to play, if there's one game on this list that you haven't played that you should, is going to be Bulk Slash. This is a fan translation that goes so much further than just translating the text. It also has full English voice acting because you have an AI co-pilot that helps you throughout the entire game navigate. Without that being in English, it's very hard to do what you need to do. This is a masterclass in fan translation and modding, and it's also one of the prettiest, in my opinion, 3D Saturn games around. I love the mix of 2D elements with 3D polygons. It runs at a really good frame rate, and it's just a very intriguing game. You're set into a level, you need to kill so many targets till you get to the boss, and then these giant robotic kaiju style bosses come down from the sky and just absolutely wreak havoc. It is an amazing game, and it's one that I know not a ton of people have played. This was a Japanese only release, and it only recently got translated and dubbed into English, so if you've never heard of it before, if you've never played it before, take my word for it. If there's one game on this list you play after the fact, on your Steam Deck or otherwise, make it Bulk Slash. It is a 10 out of 10 in my book, and it's spectacular and some of the best 3D graphics on the system. Now, speaking about best 3D graphics, let's talk about the best 2D graphics in my opinion, and that crown, very pun intended, goes to Princess Crown. I'm just showing you guys some of the intro so you can see the animations, but this is basically a RPG slash beat 'em up. But as you see the young girl here reach down and pick up that book and give it to her grandmother, this is a beautifully animated game. This is what the Sega Saturn was all about when it was a 2D powerhouse compared to the PlayStation 1. This game is intriguing, it's pretty to look at, it's amazing to play, and it does have a ton of depth. Of course, it is in Japanese, so you have to deal with that, but honestly, you're going to be able to get an entire playthrough in. You might just need to read a little bit about the story. But when Saturn was developed, Sega thought they were just going to go straight 2D, and this is what everything would have looked like if they had gone that route. But I know so many of the 32-bit systems have so much 3D, people really love to talk about it and see it. But trust me, if you love 2D, 100% play Princess Crown. I think you'll absolutely love it. But speaking of 10 out of 10 Hall of Fame first valid level of good 2D games, if you're not playing Saturn Bomberman on your Steam Deck, you are missing out on one of the best 2D games ever made, and in my opinion, absolutely the best 2D Bomberman game ever made. This is everything you want in Bomberman and a 2D game on Sega Saturn. The animations and the artwork are beautifully colorful. The gameplay, whether you're alone or with a friend, is spectacular, and if you get an 8-player multiplayer match going, it is just wild. But I will say this game also has an absolutely perfect soundtrack, so go ahead and listen for like 35 seconds, and I'll come back and tell you more about the Saturn games you should be playing. But enjoy! Just such a great soundtrack, but if we're going to talk about iconic Sega games, I'm going to recommend a racing game to you. Sega Rally is going to take the crown for the obvious choices. I could have said Daytona USA, and I actually prefer that game if we're talking about the arcade version, but when it comes to Sega Saturn 3D racing games, you have to play Sega Rally. It is fluid, it is smooth, the physics are perfect, and if you've never experienced it, it is 100% a game that you need to put onto your Steam Deck today and check out. Trust me, it's as good as it looks, it's as good as you've heard, and it is a game that takes like 10 minutes to see from start to finish. And basically a lifetime to master, doing time attacks and everything like that. But if I'm going to go on the deep cut end of the 3D racing spectrum, let's talk about Initial D on the Sega Saturn. This is not from Sega, but it is in the same Initial D series. Maybe you played games on Dreamcast or Naomi or in current arcades. The Initial D series is iconic, and seeing it running on Sega Saturn is a ton of fun. I never hear anyone mention this game, and I will say that when you get into the first person mode, it's got a great sensation of speed in 3D, something that the Sega Saturn can sometimes struggle with. Here on the Saturn with Initial D, the sensation of speed going around the corners, the drifting, everything feels really good. Now this is definitely not the best Initial D game you're going to be able to play. A lot of the modern stuff like Initial D 7 or 8 are going to be a lot better, but this is iconic Sega Saturn fun, and it's definitely a game that I feel like most people might not know actually exists. So leave me a comment down below and tell me if you knew if there was an Initial D game on the Sega Saturn. And of course, because it is Initial D, you get all of these amazing cutscenes. And now I think I've said Initial D one too many times, and we can move on to Guardian Heroes. Now this is an iconic 2D Sega Saturn hack and slash beat 'em up, and I feel like a lot of people privately heard the name, but one of the reasons I make these videos is that I grew up in the 90s and I had all of these consoles, but I know some kids were either PlayStation kids or Nintendo 64 kids, so you may have heard of this game, maybe you saw a friend play it at his house, but you never owned a Saturn and you never really got a chance to check it out. It is as good as you have heard. It's spectacular. The scaling 2D elements are amazing. The game has a deep storyline with RPG elements in it. It is just a spectacular 2D beat 'em up, and trust me, there's plenty of 2D beat 'em ups to pick from the Saturn, but you 100% have to check out Guardian Heroes if you're going to play just one. It is such a great experience, and if you bring a friend along, it's going to be even that much better. I just love this game, what it does with scaling and graphics. Again, it's just another game that shows just how good the Sega Saturn was at pulling off 2D sprite work with backgrounds. Because if we go back to the intro to the game, with all of this fire burning this tavern down, as this fight goes around, as there's like 6 to 8 sprites on screen at once, it just 100% works, and I can't recommend it enough. Now on the deep cut side of beat 'em ups for the Sega Saturn, Puli Rula, it's a hard name to pronounce, it's just an absolutely ridiculous game. This was an arcade beat 'em up from Taito, and I have a copy on both Sega Saturn and the FM Towns Marty, but it is just weird. It's strange, it's absurd, it's very simple to play, but it's a game that you should 100% experience on Steam Deck or however you choose, because it is just so wacky. This is one of those games you need to play it and see it to believe it. But the good thing is it isn't just a weird game. It is a competent beat 'em up. It is just a 2-button setup, pick up and play. But it's one of those games that I think everyone should at least play once. And we're talking about games that I think people should play on the Sega Saturn. It is on that list. I love how all the enemies turn into puppies and kittens and different animals as you rescue them. And you can use magic attacks to send a herd of those animals out to attack your opponent. It just 100% works. It's strange, it's odd, definitely give it a try. But speaking of deep cuts, Ninja Penguin Manmaru is a 3D platformer developed by Enix of Square Enix fame before they actually joined forces, and you play as this cute blue ninja penguin in a full 3D platformer. All of the background artwork 100% looks like Sega made it for Sonic the Hedgehog, but it's not a Sonic game, it is a Penguin game. But it 100% works as a 3D platformer. It's cute, it's colorful, all of the character designs are really interesting to look at, and it does have a really nice frame rate for being in 3D on the Saturn. I just love recommending this game to people because it's weird, it's something you've never heard of before, and it is a really fun game to experience. But I will say this game also has a really fun and colorful cutesy soundtrack, so go ahead and listen for 30 seconds and I'll come back and recommend more Saturn games for you, but enjoy it because it really is that good. It's such a fun soundtrack, but speaking of 3D on the Sega Saturn, if you want to see what I think is the Saturn's best 3D possible, then you 100% want to check out Burning Rangers. I'm just showing you the intro here. There is a lot more game beyond this, but I just love how this game looks in 3D, and it does go to show that when developers were using the Sega hardware to the best of its capabilities, this system could 100%, in my opinion, rival what the PlayStation 1 could do. It was a lot harder to get good 3D out of the Saturn than it was for the PlayStation 1, but Burning Rangers is an iconic game for the Saturn. If you're new to playing Saturn games, this should 100% be on your list of things to experience. It is fun, it is amazing, and it shows what the Saturn could do. Now, of course, survival horror was huge in the 32-bit era, and the Sega Saturn did get their own version of Resident Evil. Technically, there was supposed to be Resident Evil 2 as well, but that was canceled. But Resident Evil on the Sega Saturn is a great experience. It's as good as the PlayStation 1 version, and in some ways the graphics I think do look better, because this is further along than the initial release on the PlayStation 1, so I think it's a little bit more of a definitive quote-unquote version that you can play. And it's so amazing to think that Resident Evil didn't exist before this moment. I remember when this game first came out and falling in love with it, and Resident Evil 4, the remake, just released. This is a series I've been playing my entire life, and I did first play the game on Sega Saturn when I was a kid. I did have a PlayStation 1, but for some reason I didn't pick it on that. I saw a used copy at EB Games of this for the Saturn, and this is the first time I'd ever played the game. It is just one of those games that's spectacular, and if you somehow never played the original Resident Evil, play it on Saturn, it's fun. But if we talk about deep cut survival horror games on the Saturn, one game that I'm always telling everybody they should play is Deep Fear. This is Sega making a Resident Evil clone, but doing it entirely differently. This takes place under the water. You are in a basic sea base, and things are going terribly around you. It's got a ton of mechanics, including maintaining oxygen in certain areas so that you do not drown or end up dying. And it has all of the vibes and flair of Resident Evil with a completely different sort of feel and look to it. This is as good as Resident Evil in my opinion. Go ahead and leave the comment down below and tell me I'm wrong. That's fine. The algorithm loves the engagement. But if you've never heard of this game, if you've never played it, and you're looking for a new survival horror game to check out, then play Deep Fear. The only thing about this game that sucks is the voice acting, and I know Resident Evil has bad voice acting too, but this takes the crown for the worst voice acting of all time. in a really fun way though. You'll never forget it once you hear it. Now of course, no Sega Saturn list would be complete without talking about Panzer Dragoon Saga. This is one of the best role-playing games on the platform, and it is just such a wild and deep adventure. Now truth be told, I am not the biggest RPG fan. There's some I absolutely love, but I have not played every single RPG available on the console, but I can safely recommend Panzer Dragoon Saga to you. This game is just unique and fun, and it takes the formula of Panzer Dragoon 1 and 2, which are basically on-rail shooters, and expands the entire universe and gameplay style into a full role-playing game. The story in this is incredible. All of the graphics look amazing on Sega Saturn. This is the type of thing, it is a big adventure, and if you're into role-playing games and you've never played this before, this is the type of thing that you're going to 100% be able to sink your teeth into and enjoy. I love the open world aspect. I love flying around on the dragons without having to attack enemies the entire time. And the only thing I don't love is that I own this game as a kid on Sega Saturn. I traded it in for like $5 at EB Games or something different. I really wish I had my original copy because it is worth an absolute metric fortune right now. But if you're looking for a great role-playing game from the 32-bit era to play on your Steam Deck on Sega Saturn, you could do a lot worse than Panzer Dragoon Saga. This is just an absolutely incredible game. But speaking of riding around and shooting things in the air, I'm going to recommend one shmup, and it's going to be Darius Gaiden. Now there are a ton of amazing shmups on the Sega Saturn, but if you're watching a Saturn recommendation video, you probably don't know about that many of them, so I just want to give you one that's absolutely amazing, and that's going to be Darius Gaiden. I love the artwork in this game, I love the soundtrack, I love the aquatic theme that Darius always has. This is one of the Saturn's best shmups, but trust me, there's so many on there. If you fall in love with this and you're not a huge fan of shmups, just Google best shmups on the Saturn and you're going to find a massive list. But to me, this is just what I think of when I think of a Saturn shmup. It's an iconic game, it is so good, and on Saturn with Steam Deck it is amazing. And this is great in handheld mode or docked mode. It's so much fun to be able to take something like this on the train, on the way to work, and just be like, I'm going to play 20 minutes of Gaiden before I go to work. That's the great thing about the Steam Deck, and I know so many of you are getting into emulation on the go for the first time, or starting to play platforms that maybe you never checked out before, and that's why I do videos like this, to give you guys some sort of library to start with. But if you like shooting fish, then maybe you like shooting crabs, and you're looking for a first-person shooter for the Sega Saturn. Power Slave is the best on the system. That is my statement, and I stand behind it. This is just an incredible game. The game engine is amazing, the artwork, the environment, the shooting mechanics. This is just an iconic game, and it does not get mentioned as much as something like Doom or Quake ever will. Lobotomy Software knew how to make games for the Sega Saturn almost better than Sega did at some points in time, and this is just an epic adventure, so much so that it was recently remade for PC and other platforms, and they use the Saturn basis. This game does exist for DOS, but it's completely different. If you want to check out Power Slave, it's also known as Exhumed other regions, then 100% start on the Saturn. This is probably one of the most technically impressive games on the platform, and it's also one of the best first-person shooters of its era. So trust me when I say, if you're looking for a great first-person shooter to play on your Steam Deck, and since we have those analog sticks, it's great to control, 100% play Power Slave. And one last recommendation before we finish the video up, and that is going to be Shinri. If you like Power Slave in 3D shooting things, then you're going to love Shinri in 2D shooting things, because there's bugs in both games, and that's basically the only connection I can think of on the fly. But this is an iconic Sega Saturn game. It's a mix of 2D and 3D, and it is a very rare and very expensive game, so playing it on the Steam Deck is a great time. And again, so many of these games look great on the Steam Deck screen in handheld mode, but you can just drop it in the dock like I'm capturing here and 100% check it out. It's one of those games, maybe you've read a list of obscure Sega Saturn games one time and you remember the name or a screenshot from it, but if you've never played it before, check it out. It's weird, it's quirky, and just like Power Slave, you get to shoot some bugs here and there. But trust me, it's a fun time, and it's a game you definitely will not forget playing. It will stick with you. But there you go, those are my recommendations to get you started on the Sega Saturn, and there was like 30 or 40 more games I could have talked about, but I wanted to show you guys some average common games that you should definitely check out to understand what Saturn could do, and some deep cut games that you probably won't hear that many people mention. But if you guys watch these videos still, I will keep making them. Leave me a comment to know what system you want me to do a list for next, but otherwise we are done, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.